Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of GDDV 100 Game Theory 1. My name is Kasanas. Guys, we're moving along really well here, and today we're going to be tackling the idea of world building. So far, we've talked about what game is, design thinking, methodology, flow states, immersion, and we've done a kind of completed talk on narrative, an introduction to narrative. Obviously, what we've done on narrative is in no way a full-blown narrative course, right? Today we're going to be talking about the idea of world building, and we're really going to focus on how you can go about starting to build a world and build an environment in which your game begins. All right, everyone, let's get started. Okay, guys, so world building. And this is really what it comes down to. The fact that regardless of the game that you're making, it doesn't matter what type of game you're making, your game resides in some world. There's some underlying world in which your game exists. That's just the facts. Even if you don't want to include anything, if you're not intentionally including something, you are unintentionally including a world in which your game exists. And your players are going to see that, right? Obviously, your worlds, depending on the game you're making, may differ in the size, complexity, scope, scale, etc., but it exists in some way. Now, the world could be an entire planet, it could be a galaxy, or it could just be a couple of rooms. It could be a single screen in which you are living entirely for your game purposes. So obviously it can be large or small, but regardless of which one you choose, you are creating a world in which your player is going to experience your game. So therefore, understanding world building and understanding your ability to create that world is going to affect your player's immersion. And that's what we're aiming for, right? Player immersion. We want them to feel immersed within whatever it is that we're doing. So let's go through and take a look at understanding exactly what that means. World building could be something as simple as a couple of lines that you scribble down on a piece of paper so you understand where everything is taking place. It could be as simple as that, or it could be very complex and involve maps and diagrams and entire cities that you've designed. Obviously, it can change depending on what you've done, but regardless of the scope, it doesn't really matter how big your world is, your player is going to be interacting with that particular world. And in doing so, in interacting with that particular world, it's going to affect your level design, your narrative, your lore, your context, everything, even your mechanics in your game are going to be affected by the world that you create, right? And your player is going to experience all of those things through the world that you create. So when we start to talk about the idea of designing a world, how can we go about doing that? We're going to talk about two methods, the story-driven design, so basically design based on a narrative you've created, or a setting-driven design based on physical characteristics of the environment. All right, let's take a look at these. All right, so let's start off with the idea of a story-driven design. And basically, as the name implies, and as I've already suggested, a story-driven world design begins with a story of some kind, right? Your world is defined by the story that you've created. That story is going to create locations within the world, characters within the world, and all that kind of things. Whenever we've seen a film, whenever you're going to the theater and you've watched a film, when we used to get to go to the theaters before COVID, remember those days? When you used to go to the theaters and you watched a film, or you're watching a film at home, it doesn't matter where you're watching your film. Wherever you're watching your film, you watch these films and you don't require the entire history. In most cases, you don't require the entire history of the world in which this film takes place, right? We can understand through what we are given the underlying context of the existing world in which this takes place, right? And we can do so, as we've already talked about, through many different things, through the visuals we're seeing and the things we're hearing. So starting off with an interesting narrative is going to allow you to generate this game world. The game itself is going to take place around the story that you've created, right? So it's going to dictate things like your setting and your characters, or your time frame, all of that kind of thing. The great thing about a story-driven design is it's really about focusing on the characters. It's really about focusing on character and how the character is going to be involved in this particular world, right? Most stories are written about a character or an event. All right, so when we start talking about this, a story-driven design, the story itself is going to allow you to define things like locations and settings and circumstances within the narrative. And once you define these things, they need to be justified in the world that you create for your game, right? You can't simply state these things and not justify them in some way. They have to make sense. They have to be congruent with each other. You can't just have these strange events that are kind of occurring in a vacuum, because that's not how a world works. In a world, things are... they look like they belong together. They sound like they belong together. So it's going to be very important that in whatever story you've written, the surrounding world justifies the events and the characters and the settings within your story. And once you've got this core set of characters, and once you've got these locations that you described in your story, you can use this to help you build the surrounding world, right? And understanding that surrounding world. Just as a quick example, let's say you had a mage in your story, and this mage is now starting to lose her magical potency. Why? And asking yourself these questions, why? When you start to ask yourself the questions that you've introduced within your narrative, you're going to be able to create that surrounding world. Is there some type of source to her magic? Is that source being depleted by something? Is there someone else who's, using up that source? Does this automatically create for you a conflict of some kind? You can look into the different questions that your narrative may cause to arise, and then fill in those details to get yourself a more complex and complete world. Right? That's one method. The story-driven approach starts off with a narrative of some kind. And in fact, there are many, many games that start off with, or books or films and everything else, that really start off with just this simple idea, the stub of a story or a short story of some kind. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote the book The Hobbit with a simple sentence that was written on the back of one of his students' essays. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. And from that one sentence, the entire world of The Hobbit was really born. The entire story came about just from that little stub of an idea. So story-driven can take you a long way. All right, the next thing we're going to take a look at is the setting-driven design. Obviously, with a setting-driven design, it takes a setting-centric approach. And what does this mean? This means that you have an understanding of the physical world, the spaces in that world, regardless of how large that world is, obviously. You've got some type of boundaries that you've set within that world, and the world itself is then going to dictate the character. So starting off with things like maps and define boundaries and that kind of thing are going to really define the world that you're creating. Afterward, it is that physical space, that physical design that is going to define things like the people who live there, right? If you've got an area of mountains, there's going to be people who are able to survive within those mountains, as an example. So the world that you create through these different maps and understanding the geography and the actual setting that your game is going to be taking place in is going to define a lot of the other things that take place, right? By creating these different boundaries, by creating these different settings within the world, it's going to allow the underlying story to kind of emerge, and that's going to define things like who your characters are, and you'll have a better understanding of that. And again, a lot of stories, films, and games are written in this way. So it took Tolkien a dozen years to write The Lord of the Rings, and he started the entire thing with maps. He started the entire thing by defining the languages of the people. So the maps themselves generated the people that lived in those different sections, and the people that lived there each had their own language, and all of this underlying history and geography and society, all of this is what he used to generate his simple narratives. Not as simple, obviously they weren't simple narratives, but to generate his individual narratives, right? He designed the entire world in which everything took place first, and then he chose little stories that occurred within that vast, vast world. All right, a quote from Tolkien: "I wisely started with a map and made the story fit." So he fit his story to the map that he created. Setting-driven design is all about laying the groundwork. So you begin with things like maps and sketches, and understanding the different locations that are within the world, the important locations. Obviously, you don't have to understand all of them. You might want to break it down into a physical, political, or social boundaries of some kind. And once you understand the different systems that are involved in the world that you create, the the game itself is going to be made to fit within that particular world. And you're able to, by adjusting these things, able to iterate this fairly frequently, right? If you're starting off with these imaginary maps, you can iterate the idea and test your idea to make sure that the things actually fit in there. You know, would the mountains actually be next to this particular area, and what happens when these people clash? The narrative itself will come about by creating these boundaries. By creating boundaries, social, economical, political, physical boundaries, you're going to define things like conflict within the world, right? Are these two people fighting over a particular resource? Is there only one lake in your world? Once you understand these things, the limitations of the world that you've created through the geography, through the map that you've created, your game is then going to fit within that space, right? And the stories will come out about those particular areas, right? So you might ask yourself, you know, if you've created a particular location, who lives in that particular location? You know, why is this piece of land more important than this piece of land? You know, what occurred in this thing? What's the history of these different areas? Once you start understanding these things, you've defined your world, and your game must fit within those boundaries that you've created. And again, we've got Tolkien. I got a lot of Tolkien in here. I have long ceased to invent. I wait till I seem to know what really happened, or till it writes itself. So again, he creates everything. He created all the histories for the Lord of the Rings. He created all the geography. He created all the maps. He created everything like that. And then he understood what occurred in those different areas. Okay, so awesome. Once we've got these things, we have to start adding detail to our worlds. So it doesn't really matter which approach you've taken, a story-centric or a setting-centric approach. Regardless of which one you have decided to go on, you might want to consider certain things about the world that you've created. Understanding the world environments, understanding the world factions, understanding the world cultures, and understanding the populace that lives within your world. When we talk about the idea of world environments, there's going to be very specific areas in which your game takes place. So it's not necessary to understand the entirety of every single location on a vast world, right? If you are creating a game about a spaceport, then understanding the people that come into there and understanding these different things within your game and how they relate to each other is going to be important. But it's not necessary to understand every single city or the details of every single city, right? It's not important to describe the specific details of the largest cities that are near the spaceport. Understanding there's a large city near the spaceport is going to be important. Understanding that this spaceport is an intergalactic spaceport is going to be important. That they might come from a nearby planet called Fulion, and Fulion has the following. You might want to understand these things. That's going to define the people in those worlds. But it's not necessarily important to describe every single last detail about all of the surrounding space. You're going to want to add specific details to your game area, to your gameplay area. So now we'll take a look at world factions. What does world factions mean? There's going to be groups of people within your world. How do those people interact? How do the people across these different cultures interact? Are they in conflict with each other? Are they friendly? And understanding these types of relationships, again, can drive details within your world, right? It can help you with the idea of level design. If you're crossing a threshold from one cultural space to another, you have to understand what those particular details are. And again, it's not important that you include immense details about every single culture within your world, but those that are immediately affecting the area in which your game takes place is going to be very important, right? And again, when we're talking about the type of game you make, world factions and might be less important, right? If you're talking about an RPG of some kind, then it might be extremely important. If you're talking about a real-time strategy game, again, things like factions might be real important. You're going to have particular symbols and particular way these people interact amongst themselves. So in some games, it'll be more important than others, obviously. But things like world factions can definitely aid in level design and in quest design and those kind of things where it's important that these people who are interacting together will change how your players behave with them. So moving on from world factions, let's take a look at the idea of world cultures. And they're related, right? Understanding the people that live in one area or the people that are involved in some culture or subculture or some sub-society within a space is going to add details and allow your player to make it feel like it's a larger space. The same thing is true of world cultures. Understanding that there are other cultures within your world and what different people from different areas may behave like or what items from different areas of your world may look like is going to make the world that you create feel more vast than it actually is. in most cases, the games we create are going to have borders, right? We're going to have limitations in how far the player can explore. In those cases, in those particular cases, having these off-screen cultures that influence the play space is going to make it feel like the player is involved in a larger world than they actually are, right? By allowing these different cultures to creep in through the borders of the game you create, the player is going to be experiencing other aspects of the world without actually have to leave that space. So by adding in things like I said, like world cultures or factions, that kind of thing is definitely going to make your world seem alive. It's definitely going to make your world seem alive. And again, it can also lead to things like conflict, and it can lead to particular level design or particular quests that's going to be created based on these different world cultures that's been created. Now, I do want to give you a word of warning. When it comes to things like factions or world cultures or even things like NPCs that you add within your world, which we'll talk about in the next slide, you really need to be aware of cultural appropriation or stereotypes, right? And we've all seen this. We've all seen some of the new Star Wars movies, like the first Star Wars movies, the Clone Wars, and that. There were a lot of people who were talking about the stereotypes included within those worlds. It's very important that you are aware if you're including symbolism, if you are including something that looks like an existing real world culture in your game, you're going to want to be very wary of cultural appropriation. It's not that you can't include items or ideas that are not directly involved in the culture that you have been brought up in. It's not that at all. But it's extremely important that you are researching and giving appropriate consideration to the cultural events or the cultural phenomena or even just the generalized culture of whatever it is you're adding to your particular game. All right, that's just a word of warning. It's very difficult. You know, games themselves are filled with cultural appropriation. They are filled with stereotypes, and we can avoid those things. We should be avoiding those things, right? The last thing I want to talk about now is the idea of adding NPCs to your game, the populace of the world in which you're creating. And a game, if you're building an RPG or you're building a real-time strategy or something like that, in which you're creating a space, or an adventure game or anything like that, in which you're creating a space in which there are supposed to be people, adding people to your game is extremely important, right? It's going to make that particular world feel full. It's going to make it feel alive. It's going to make it feel real. Again, when you start to add in the different populace of your world, the different characters, the NPC characters that your player is going to be involved with, it's important to take everything else that we spoke about into account. You know, where are they from? What society or culture do they belong to? All that kind of stuff is going to influence exactly how your non-player characters are reacting in your world. But adding these characters are going to be extremely important. You have a lot of different choices in here. You can have, if you're building, let's say, an RPG and you want to fill that world in, you can have characters that can be interacted with. And obviously, we're going to have to add details to those particular NPCs, right? If you don't, then your player is going to have a less than a realistic world. We also may have characters that are just walking about you know, with a single line of dialogue and that kind of thing. They're not meant to be interacted with in any way. They're just there to make the world itself feel larger. Now, again, adding different people into the world you create are sources of quests and level design and things like that as well. So make sure that you are adding appropriate characters to your game that are going to make the world itself feel alive. All right, everyone, that's really our introduction to world building. Understanding the world you're creating is going to mean understanding the scope in which the game itself takes place, right? If you are if you're creating yourself an RPG of some kind, you're going to need a very, very highly detailed game. If you're creating a game that has more simplistic world to it, you still have a world, and understanding that world is going to define how the art you create, the lighting you have, the soundscape, and everything else. So it's going to be important for regardless of which type of game you are creating. But this is simply an introduction to the idea of world building. The only way to really go through it is to do it. All right, everyone, I hope you enjoyed that. And if you did, let me know down below in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Let me know with a thumbs up if you liked it. A thumbs down if you didn't is perfectly fine. All right, everyone, thumbs up, thumbs down, comments down below, and if you haven't done so, please take a few seconds to subscribe. Have yourselves a wonderful day, everyone.